Welcome back to our series of audio lessons on the book of Esther. Today we'll look at chapter 8. Before we get into chapter 8, let's take a quick look at what's happened so far. From the time Esther appeared before the king in chapter 5 until the end of chapter 7, less than 48 hours have passed, but what an eventful 48 hours it has been. It's full of coincidences and reversals of fortune. As her plan unfolds, Esther appears before Xerxes, unsummoned, which could have led to her death. She invites Xerxes and Haman to go to a banquet that evening. The banquet goes well. Haman is riding an ego high. He is the counselor for the king, number 2 in the empire, the grand vizier, and now confidant to the queen. Esther delays her request until the next day when another banquet will be held. Then she will reveal all to the king. As Haman leaves in high spirits, he sees Mordecai, and our first reversal. His huge ego is deflated at the mere sight of that Jew, Mordecai. At home, after he complains to his wife and friends, a plan is formed to hang Mordecai. Then comes the eventful night, a night of many coincidences that just happened. It started off with the king not being able to sleep. Remember, the Septuagint says that the Lord took sleep from the king that night. Then there was the choice of entertainment, the reading of the Chronicles. He could have had more pleasant forms, singers or soft music, something like that. Eventually, the selection read from the Chronicles. Mordecai foiled the assassination plot 5 years earlier, but was not rewarded. Then there was Haman's timely arrival, soon after the king discovered this royal oversight, and fresh from the overseeing of the construction of the gallows on which to hang Mordecai. To rectify his oversight, Xerxes wants to reward the man whom the king delights to honor. But how? Haman's ego, reinflated, causes him to suffer a communication failure. In his mind, the king could not possibly want to honor anyone more than himself. So, Haman himself dictates the grand reward for the man whom the king delights to honor. Put him in royal robes, seat him on a royal horse with all the royal saddlery, and have a high noble parading him through the town, proclaiming in him the king's delight. Xerxes proclaims this is to be done, but another reversal, not to Haman, but to Mordecai, the Jew who sits at the king's gate. And in a double reversal, Haman is the noble to do it. After suffering what is in his eyes a day-long humiliation, Haman runs home, covering his head in shame. After recalling the day's events to his wife and friends, a consensus is reached. Haman will surely fall before the king because Mordecai is a Jew. There's no explanation why Mordecai being a Jew is significant. At this point, I don't know if they're thinking of a life-threatening situation. Neither Haman nor Xerxes knows Esther's nationality, nor her relationship with Mordecai, nor how Haman's edict will affect her. I think they understand Haman's political career and prestige are done, which, for him, is as good as death, to fall before that Jew Mordecai. Of course, none of this is true. It's just supposition on their part, another communication failure. There's no indication Xerxes told Haman why Mordecai was to be honored. Haman thought Mordecai was being honored because he was on the rise in Xerxes' eyes. He was not. And that Haman was on the decline. He was not. At Esther's second banquet, she deftly reveals the plot to destroy her and her people. It's not merely a plot to sell them into slavery. She would not bother the king with such a trivial matter, as one translation has it. It's not just a plot to kill the Jews. Esther does not directly mention she is a Jew. You see, it's a plot to kill her and her people. Haman is revealed as the architect of the plot, with no mention of Xerxes' complicity. As Xerxes leaves in rage, Haman commits error upon error. He stays behind at the banquet table to beg Esther for his life. This is a serious breach of protocol. No one other than the king and trusted eunuchs are to be alone with the queen. He is apparently pacing or pursuing Esther around the room as he begs and stumbles over her couch where she sits, just as Xerxes returns. Xerxes sees this as an assault on the queen and a capital offense. In another reversal, Xerxes orders Haman hung on the same gallows meant for Mordecai. Now avenged, the king's anger subsides. Back in chapter 4, when Mordecai persuaded Esther to plead for the Jews, he tasked her with a mission impossible with 4 objectives. Number 1, go before the king. Well, she did so. Unsummoned, she broke a law which could have led to her death if the king did not allow her entry. Done. Number 2, make her appeal to the king on behalf of herself and her people. To do this, she would have to keep from the king that she had not been completely honest with him about her ethnicity. She worked around that in chapter 7. Scratch that off the list. Number 3, she had to oppose and expose Haman for the death sentence he passed against her and her people, but not bring any implication against the king. Check. And this leads to Haman's death. Number 4, convince the king to reverse Haman's order, an irreversible law of the Persians. How is she going to do that? Well, let's get into chapter 8. We'll read the first 2 verses. On that day, King Ahasuerus gave to Queen Esther the house of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. And Mordecai came before the king, for Esther had told what he was to her. And the king took off his signet ring, which he had taken from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. And Esther set Mordecai over the house of Haman. On that day, the eventful day continues. We said last time that these 2 verses better belong with chapter 7 because they're a continuation of the same day. In ancient Persia, if you brought a capital accusation against another person and it was proven true, the accused was executed and you, as the accuser, received all his property. Haman, when he convinced Xerxes to kill, destroy, and annihilate the certain people, had essentially accused the Jews of being traitorous. They have their own law, they don't obey the king's law. As we saw, no attempt was made to verify, and the guilt was assumed. The eradication would have been all the proof necessary, even if it was after the fact. Haman would have received all the possessions of all the Jews throughout the empire, making him much wealthier than the 10,000 talents of silver promised to the king. The king's accusation of assault on the queen was Haman's downfall. Since Haman's crime was against Esther, another reversal here. All his possessions reverted to the king, and Xerxes grants them to Esther. Mordecai is summoned before the king after Esther finally reveals her relationship to him. Some think this entailed only that he was her cousin. Others think she related to Xerxes the entirety of her life. Yes, he was her cousin, but also her adopted father, protector, and guide all her life. I think the latter. Just being introduced as her cousin would hardly have been enough to reward Mordecai as done later, but to have been a parent, protector, guide of the queen, and a driving force behind righting this grievous wrong would have. Another reversal. Because of the influence of Mordecai had on Esther's life and his loyal service to the king, and because the position of number 2 had just come open, Mordecai is given the signet ring formerly worn by Haman. From what we know of Xerxes, he had given it to Haman to deal with affairs of state because Xerxes found them to be tedious. Now Mordecai is the new Grand Vizier. The Hebrew word translated here as taken away in the Septuagint is translated with a Greek word meaning to take by force. It's the same word used in Luke 22:50 to describe the cutting off of Malchus's ear in the garden. This might give us an indication of how the ring was taken away from Haman. Esther puts Mordecai over her newly obtained property. Esther's life was in the harem and palace. She had no need of Haman's property. But to give it outright to Mordecai would have been insult to the king. So she did the next best thing. She put him in charge of all of it. In chapter 3, verse 10, when Xerxes gave the ring to Haman, Xerxes told Haman to keep the 10,000 talents of silver to finance the genocide. Now, in another reversal, Mordecai gets control of Haman's money and estate. It's unknown what happened to Haman's wife. Let's look at verses 3 through 8. Then Esther spoke again to the king. She fell at his feet and wept and pleaded with him to avert the evil plan of Haman the Agagite and the plot he had devised against the Jews. When the king held out the golden scepter to Esther, Esther rose and stood before the king and said, "If it please the king, and if I have found favor in his sight, and if the thing seems right before the king, and I am pleasing in his eyes, let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha, which he wrote to destroy the Jews who are in all the provinces of the king. For how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people, or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred? Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, Behold, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and hanged him on the gallows, because he intended to lay hands on the Jews. But you may write as you please with regard to the Jews, in the name of the king, and seal it with the king's ring, for an edict written in the name of the king and sealed with the king's ring cannot be revoked. The enemy of the Jews is dead. He's called that twice more in chapter 9. But his edict remains in effect. Again, Esther goes before the king to complete part 4 of her mission. We don't know how much time has passed between verses 2 and 3. It may be that that day had been such a busy one. The building of the gallows by Haman, the sleepless night for the king, a pony ride for Mordecai, a banquet, an execution, a change in administration. Maybe the edict had been forgotten temporarily. Esther comes before the king a second time. It appears this was also an unannounced visit because Xerxes again extends his scepter. This time she has fallen before the king's feet, weeping and begging Xerxes to reverse Haman's edict. We mentioned last time that the grabbing of someone's feet while begging a favor was a common action. Take a look back at chapter 4, verse 8. There, what did Mordecai tell Esther to do? To go to the king, beg his favor, plead with him on behalf of her people. Was this display now before Xerxes a heartfelt emotional outburst, or was this just phase 4 of the plan? I think it looks like both. Look how she approaches Xerxes in verse 5 and compare it to the other appearances. In her first appearance before Xerxes, she says, if it pleases the king. At the first banquet, she says, if I had found favor in the sight of the king, if it pleases the king. At the second banquet, she says the same thing. If I have found favor in your sight, if it pleases the king. This is normal court etiquette. But in chapter 8, verse 5, she says, if it pleases the king, if I have found favor in his sight, again, normal court etiquette. But she adds, if the thing seems right before the king, if I am pleasing in his eyes. She's kind of laying it on thick, adding that Xerxes should only do this if it seems right to him. The word here does not mean in the sense of morally or ethically right, but if advantageous or proper or would bring the king success. And she says, if she personally has pleased the king. All she wanted was to revoke Haman's edict. What do we know about the laws of the Medes and Persians? They cannot be revoked. Esther is careful of two things here. One, not to say anything that might implicate the king. She did this at the second banquet as well. And two, not to refer to the edict with language that might give it an air of authority. She calls it letters. Other translations have dispatches, written by Haman the Agagite, the son of Hammedatha. You see, these were not laws written by the king, although they did bear the king's signet. Esther plays up her newly strengthened relations with Xerxes and personalizes her request. For how can I bear to see the calamity that is coming to my people? Or how can I bear to see the destruction of my kindred? This is another example of thought rhyme in Hebrew, saying the same thing two different ways. There's no mention of herself. Maybe she thinks the king will spare her, or maybe he has indicated so, despite the edict. She says, do this for me. Xerxes' response is a non-reversal. Look, I gave you everything he owned. I hung him because he was going to kill the Jews. What more can I do? You know I can't revoke a law. But here's what you can do. Write whatever you want to the Jews and seal it with the king's signet. That law can't be revoked either. Let the new Grand Vizier take care of this, as we will see later. Let's look at verses 9 through 14. The king's scribes were summoned at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day. And an edict was written according to all that Mordecai commanded concerning the Jews to the satraps and the governors and the officials of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to each province in its own script, to each people in its own language, and also to the Jews in their script and language. And he wrote in the name of King Ahasuerus, and sealed it with the king's signet ring. Then he sent letters by mounted couriers riding on swift horses that were used in the king's service, bred from the royal stud, saying that the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to gather and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, children and women included, and to plunder their goods, all in one day throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. A copy of what was written was issued as a decree in every province, being publicly displayed to all peoples, and the Jews were to be ready on that day to take vengeance on their enemies. So the couriers mounted their swift horses that were used in the king's service, rode out hurriedly, urged by the king's command, and the decree was issued in Susa, the citadel. Let's compare the edicts of Haman and Mordecai and look at a timetable. We know that Haman cast the pur in the first month and set the date for the action as the 13th day of the 12th month. He caused the scribes to write his edict on the 13th day of the first month. Mordecai caused the scribes to write his edict on the 23rd day of the third month, a little more than 2 months after Haman's edict. Haman wrote to the king's satraps, governors, and princes over each province. Mordecai wrote to the king's satraps, governors, princes of each province. Haman wrote to each people in their own language. Mordecai wrote to each people in their own language and to the Jews in their language. Apparently, Haman's edict was not written in Hebrew. They had to find out about the decree through other sources. Haman's edict was sent out hurriedly by couriers by the order of the king. Mordecai's was sent out on mounted couriers on the king's best and swiftest horses. They rode out hurriedly. They were urged on by the king. Interestingly, the King James Version says camels and mules. I'm just not sure how fast that would be. Haman's edict was to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young, old, women, children, and to plunder their property. And now in another reversal, Mordecai wrote to the Jews they can assemble and defend themselves. They can destroy, kill, and annihilate only if attacked first. But if attacked, they could do whatever they wanted or needed to take vengeance on the attackers. This would be any people from any province who might attack them, including women and children, and they were allowed to plunder the goods. Here is another reversal of sorts. In 1 Samuel 15, when Samuel tells Saul to utterly destroy the Amalekites, they are told to not plunder the spoils. Mordecai used the legal language used by Haman as a template, only self-defense was the priority. You'll notice that about 70 days had passed between the two edicts. Again, because biblical histories sometimes don't give us all the detail we'd like, there's some disagreement about the timing of events. Some think Xerxes' approval for Haman's edict and the issuing of it at the end of chapter 3, and Mordecai's appeal to Esther at the beginning of chapter 4 happened in rapid succession, perhaps 1 week. They think the bulk of the 70 days came between Haman being hanged in chapter 7, verse 10, and chapter 8, verse 3, when Esther went before the king the second time. Maybe everybody was waiting around for Xerxes to do something, and when he didn't, Esther approached him. Some think Xerxes did nothing because he had given Mordecai the signet ring to do as he pleased, and it was Mordecai that had caused the delay by his inaction. Others think the bulk of the 70 days came between Xerxes' approval of Haman's edict and Mordecai approaching Esther between chapters 3 and chapter 4. They argue it would have taken some time to dictate the edict, translate it in all the different languages, and make multiple copies before sending it out. If the events of chapter 4, that's Mordecai convincing Esther, to chapter 8, verse 8, and that's Xerxes' approval of Mordecai's edict, if that took about a week, 1 day for Mordecai to communicate to Esther, the 3-day fast, 1 day for the first banquet, 1 day for the second banquet and Haman's execution, and then 8:1 tells us on that day. Well, that's 6 days. And Mordecai called the scribes at once. It would have been about 64, 65 days to get Haman's legislation completed. Translation, approval, so forth. Mordecai's edict would have taken a little less time because he was using Haman's language, only including the information about self-defense. But they still had to be written from scratch with multiple copies for each language, so we're looking at maybe another 60 days. All that's academic, of course, because God gives us all the information we need. When Mordecai called for the scribes, the Jews at D-Day about minus 8.5 months. Time was of the essence. That's why the scribes were called at once. That's why the edict was sent out on the king's best horses. How big was the Persian Empire? We've seen this before. 127 provinces stretching from India to Ethiopia to Libya to Greece to Kazakhstan. From Susa to Patala on the Indus Delta along the trade routes was about 1,500 miles. To Thebes, about 1,800 miles. To Cyrene, about 2,000 miles. To Byzantium, about 1,600 miles. And to Cryopolis, about 1,500 miles. Between 1860 and 1861, the Pony Express ran from St. Joseph, Missouri to Sacramento, California, a distance of a little less than 2,000 miles. Changing horses and riders every 10 to 15 miles, riding day and night, they delivered the mail in about 10 to 12 days on a single prescribed route. In the Persian Empire, the only good road, the only road that was maintained, the Royal Road, was between Susa and Sardis, about 1,600 miles. It is estimated that normal travel, the Royal Road via camels or mules, would have taken 80 to 100 days. Riding in the fashion of the Pony Express, and only along the Royal Road, no side trips, communications could have been relayed in about 10 days. However, except for Sardis, from Susa to the extremes of the empire would have taken longer. They'd have had to stop at each major city in each province, read the proclamation, post it, and then take off to the next city. Most of these were off the main trade routes. The riders would have had to get off the interstate and get on the FMs to fulfill their missions. Some provinces were islands off the coasts of Asia Minor and Greece, for example, Cyprus. Some riders would have had to cross the Hellespont to get to the portion of the empire in Macedonia, and in the east they'd have had to cross the Straits of Hormuz to get to the portion of the empire in Arabia. Depending on, number one, how many cities they had to stop at, there would be more cities in Asia Minor and Mesopotamia, fewer in the north and east. Number two, how far each was off the trade routes. There may have been some secondary trade routes branching off the main ones in the more populated areas. And three, the condition of the roads. Well, some roads could have been no more than an animal trail or a path. These times could have easily doubled or tripled to 20 to 30 days. But as one author suggests, if each major city had a single rider dedicated to it, then a 10 to 20 day time frame could be expected. Taking all this into consideration, for the Jews in the far reaches of the empire, by the time Mordecai's edict arrived, it would have been at best D-Day minus 6 months. One decent estimate for preparation time for the Jews over the entire empire would be about 6 months. For those closer to Susa or along the Royal Road, less, but in the farther reaches of the empire, it had taken longer. 6 months seems like a long time to prepare, but was it? It's been about 250 years since the Assyrian captivity of the 10 northern tribes of Israel. It's been about 130 years since the first group of Jews were taken into captivity and placed under first Babylonian and then Persian rule. They were a conquered people. By this time, they had had few, if any, with any military skill or training, unless they were in the Persian military. They needed first to arm themselves and then to do some training to fight against what is called in verse 8:11 an armed force. To put that in perspective, after the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, the first military action the U.S. was able to engage in was the Battle of the Coral Sea, a naval engagement, in May 1942. The first land battle was Guadalcanal in August of 1942, 5 and 8 months, respectively, with an existing, albeit small, standing Army and Navy. 6 months was not a lot of time. Let's finish the chapter, beginning with verse 15. Then Mordecai went out from the presence of the king in royal robes of blue and white, with a great golden crown, and a robe of fine linen and purple, and the city of Susa shouted and rejoiced. The Jews had light and gladness and joy and honor. And in each province and in every city where the king's command and his edict reached, there was gladness and joy among the Jews, a feast and a holiday. And many of the peoples of the country declared themselves Jews, for the fear of the Jews had fallen on them. Mordecai and Esther have done all they can. Now it's up to how fast can the new edict be spread, and how well and how fast the Jews can arm and prepare for the onslaught. And here's another reversal. Where before Haman wore the royal colors, they are now Mordecai's. Well, actually, we're never told that Haman wore the royal colors, but the fact that Mordecai is wearing them now, in a position previously held by Haman, implies Haman also wore them. In addition to the ring and the colors, Mordecai also wears a golden crown. This would probably have been something more like a turban. And he wears garments of fine linen and purple, the royal colors. This is another reversal from the sackcloth he wore in chapter 4. One author suggests that the royal vestments worn by Mordecai would have been reminiscent of the priestly garments. No Jew in Susa at this time had ever seen the priestly dress. They had only possibly read about it in the Pentateuch. And, as such, the Jews of Susa may have looked on Mordecai as some sort of a priest before God, interceding with his people. Maybe, maybe not. But one thing is for certain. The sight of Mordecai in his new attire generated yet another reversal, this time among the Jews and the people. In chapter 3, Susa is in confusion, bewilderment, perplexity over Haman's edict. Now they shout and rejoice. The Jews in chapter 4 mourned, repented, and fasted. Now there is light, gladness, joy, and honor. They are no longer seen as a certain people set for destruction. Another reversal. Now they are being honored by having one of their own as the number 2 man in Persia. Now they have a protector over them. The irony here is that they always had a protector, and it was his plan that was coming to fruition. We can understand why the Jews are so joyful, but why the rest of the people? It may be that they so despised Haman for whatever reason, how he came to power, his attitude toward the people, his management style, that they too were relieved and joyful at his demise. Just as in chapter 3, when Haman's decree ran through the empire and a ripple of mourning accompanied it, another reversal. Now a wave of joy and gladness, feasting, and a holiday accompany Mordecai's edict. So much so that many became Jews. What does it mean to become Jews? One suggested they became Jews to carry out offensive attacks in the name of the Jews to exact their own revenge on others or discredit the Jews. I don't see that as very likely. Perhaps it was a way of showing solidarity with the Jews in the coming conflict. In 1981, when President Reagan was shot, just before he went into surgery, he said, "I hope there are some good Republicans in here." To which one of the doctors replied, "We're all Republicans today, Mr. President." And in the aftermath of 9/11, most of the world stood shoulder to shoulder with the U.S., declaring, "We are all New Yorkers now." Did these Persians convert from their pagan gods to become proselytes? Probably not. To become a full proselyte, they would have had to be initiated into the Jewish faith by a priest. In this case, the best they could have become would have been God-fearers, like Cornelius in Acts 10. Did they pretend to be Jews, either for protection from some other force or for the newfound protection from the empire? Whatever their motivation, it was driven by the fear of the Jews and their God. They didn't want to be seen as opposing the Jews. 2 very different decrees have been issued, one of death, one of life, and the clock is ticking. Well, that'll do it for chapter 8. Next time we'll finish our studies with chapters 9 and 10. Until then, may God bless you.